In 1997, Knott's Berry Farm in Buena Park, California opened Windjammer Surf Racers. This is a unique Togo crazy mouse that would feature 2 racing tracks. This was supposed to be a spiritual successor to the wacky soapbox racers. However, Windjammer was highly problematic. The ride was insanely rough to the point where it would cause headbanging and it was constantly closed all the time. It got so bad that Knott's sued Togo seeking property damage from the coaster, causing Togo to file for Chapter 7 bankruptcy. Why did Windjammer cause Knott's to sue Togo? This is how Windjammer Surf Racers sued a company into bankruptcy. In an earlier Ride Analyze episode, I previously discussed how Knott's Berry Farm was formed from a restaurant serving food associated with black people. If you didn't get that last part, I'm referring to fried chicken meals. This chicken brought thousands of people to the Knott's restaurant. To relieve some of the crowds, Knott's built a series of attractions that would eventually become Knott's Berry Farm. But they didn't start adding rides at first. Initially, all Knott's had was a pure replica ghost town, except for all the people there, of course. Unlike actual ghost towns that are more abandoned than the nuclear plant that took out the ghost towns. They didn't actually start adding rides until the 1960s. Roller coasters specifically weren't introduced until 1975. This would be the corkscrew. This is the prototype corkscrew coaster from Aerodynamics. This was revolutionary because this was the first modern coaster to flip riders upside down since the early 1900s. Previous looping coasters were poorly designed and caused major neck and back pain to riders like they're escaping the jungles of Vietnam, but Aero's new design could safely flip riders upside down. Aero produced 4 in 1975 alone, but Knott's got theirs open first. It was a novelty going upside down as nobody felt that type of sensation before. As a result, Corkscrew became a huge hit for Knott's. Following the success of Corkscrew, Knott's approached Aero for a radically different type of ride. This would be the wacky soapbox racers. This is a unique steeplechase coaster where riders ride in individual cars and race on a tamed track. Originally opening as Motorcycle Chase, the original cars featured 2 passenger motorcycles. However, due to issues with the original cars, the trains and theme were changed to soapboxes soon after. The layout would consist of 4 tracks traversing gentle turns and hills, but despite being a gentle family ride, Wacky Soapbox Racers was beloved for its fun racing element. Many enjoyed the fun factor Soapbox Racers had. That's kinda surprising considering its sister coaster in Steeplechase at Blackpool Pleasure Beach kinda sucks from what I heard. But then again, they're still using the original horses, so you know. Needless to say, many were sad when Knott's removed Soapbox Racers in 1996. While many were disappointed, little did anyone knew at the time the replacement would be even more disappointing. Based on the popularity of Soapbox Racers, Knott's attempted to replicate this success by building a spiritual successor. Their solution led them to a contractor on the other side of the Pacific. In their attempt to bring something in, Knott's search led them to Japanese manufacturer Togo. Founded in 1935, Togo would progress a slow transition into roller coasters and flat rides. Yes, I did say 1935, meaning Togo survived tanking 2 nuclear bombs 10 years later. Togo first began in the art of the roller coaster with, well, roller coaster at Japan's Hanayashiki Park in 1953. Yeah, that's right, Togo built a steel coaster before tubular tracks were a thing. Slowly but surely, Togo would build a name for itself as the premier manufacturer in Japan. The most prominent example of their creation is the stand-up coaster. This is a type of coaster where riders stand instead of sitting down. They initially converted 2 of their sit-down coasters with stand-up trains before turning to ground-up installations. 3 of them would end up at the then Taft Parks, Kings Island, King's Dominion, and Canada's Wonderland. King Cobra at Kings Island specifically was the first ground-up stand-up coaster in 1984. Realizing the need to better serve the international clients, Togo established American offices and testing facilities in Ohio. In 1986, Togo brought New Jersey's Six Flags Great Adventure Ultra Twister, a unique pipeline coaster that sees riders in a pipe of steel. By the mid-90s, Togo was experiencing a boom outside of Japan. Unfortunately, its American division sucked ass when it comes to making roller coasters. Even though their rides in Japan are well received, for whatever reason, all but Ultra Twister rode like crap that also punches the sonic rings out of you here in the States. They're like that one foreign dude that the teacher would constantly use, but everyone else hated because he'd find a way to hurt you with maximum pain. An example would be in 1995 when Great Adventure brought Togo back for Viper, a compact looping coaster that sucked major ass that only filled the layout with headaches and broken parts, only lasting 9 years before realizing Viper was cooked. 2 years later, they introduced the iconic Manhattan Express at Las Vegas's New York Hotel and Casino, a full hypercoaster that also sucked with terrible restraints and poorly made transitions. It's crazy how bad those loopers were when at the same time, Togo brought us Fujiyama at Japan's Fuji-Q Highland, a massive hypercoaster that, while has some pacing issues, is generally well received. And if that wasn't enough, 2 months later came the coaster that eventually killed Togo. When Knott's approached Togo for a new racing coaster, they required something compact. As I mentioned in the previous Knott's episode on Ghost Rider, Knott's has to be careful when adding coasters due to a lack of space. Look at this Google Maps images. Knott's is completely developed with attractions as well as being surrounded by homes and businesses. The latter adds an extra challenge of getting projects approved from noise. That challenge is mostly due to neighbors being total jackasses that hate you for all the noise and refuse to move. You know, despite the fact that it's their choice to live there and assuming they're not a broke millennial can relocate somewhere else. If it wasn't an issue, Knott's would have gotten that giga by now, but they still don't have anything close to that. So unless Knott's removes an attraction, they have to get creative to make space. So with limited space and noise in mind, Knott's selected the Crazy Mouse. For those who don't know, Togo's Crazy Mouse is essentially a wild mouse with inversions. The usual layout mainly consists of hairpin turns, but also throw in both a loop and a corkscrew. With a coaster that's thrilling while compact and cheap, Knott's and Togo would develop a custom-made Crazy Mouse called Windjammer Surf Racers. Instead of hairpin turns found on their other installations, this custom model would have a more sprawling layout in the park's boardwalk section. The most defining feature is the 2 tracks that would race each other. Windjammer Surf Racers opened on March 26, 1997. The ride would consist of the following. Passengers choose either the red or yellow track and board essentially 2 wild mouse cars chained together and pull down their over-the-shoulder restraints. The red and yellow side have, for the most part, the same layout, so the ride experience will apply to both sides. The ride begins with a 69-foot, 21-meter tall lift hill. After a right-hand turn is Windjammer's first drop, reaching its top speed of 40 miles per hour or 64 kilometers per hour. This is followed by the coaster's lone inversion, a vertical loop. Next is a sharp rise into a left-hand turn into the mid-course brake run. After this is a series of slow banked turns, shallow dips, and another mid-course brake run into the station. While the coaster was indeed short, it seemed like a solid attraction. Plus, with the racing feature and theoretical 10-train operations, the ride promises short wait times and solid fun factor. However, beyond its visual appeal, Windjammer was a full-on disaster for the park. Literally from day one, Windjammer suffered extreme problems that screwed up the operations. First of all, the yellow track was said to have rarely operated at all during its tenure. This means almost no one, and I mean no one, got to ride the yellow side. This also meant the racing element was completely eliminated as only one side would operate at a time. The lack of racing was already a problem, but the maintenance side was even more of a headache. As it turns out, Windjammer was completely unreliable. Maintenance issues forced the coaster to break down constantly. The biggest headache was, quite ironically, the wind. Now, high winds are an issue with every outdoor coaster because the winds can shut down the coaster for the day. The problem with Windjammer was that the minimum wind speed to shut down the coaster was just 3 miles per hour. Bruh, that's just a slight breeze. I run faster than the wind speed to shut down Windjammer. To put this into perspective, if you were to fly a drone near the coaster, which first of all, don't use drones near theme parks without proper clearance. That's a safety hazard that will get you sued and arrested, with also a sprinkle of police brutality. But if you were to, the wind from the spinning blades of the drone would already cause the ride to close. Why would a coaster have that severe of a problem from the tiniest cause? Well, there are 2 theories. The first is sensors. This one is purely speculation, but the sensors could likely be extremely sensitive, more so than a New Yorker when someone references 9/11 or the Twin Towers to them, so the sensors could fault and shut down from the lowest wind. The second, more likely suggestion is that the layout is poorly designed and constructed. This is where we addressed how bad of a coaster Windjammer was. On the comfort side, the ride was littered with severe head-banging roughness that left riders with migraines, and it didn't help that the over-the-shoulder restraints were unpadded, so every turn would be a hard slam into the restraints. Based on the reviews, I feel like getting run over by a drunk driver would be less painful than riding Windjammer. Knott's reported issues with misaligned and poorly designed tracks, defective safety restraints, fatigue, and wrinkles in the train's main frame. So Knott's was more stressed out than the kids working at the Timu sweatshops trying to get Windjammer to be rideable. On top of that, even if Windjammer was relatively smooth, the layout is boring as shit. After the loop into the mid-course, the ride suffers from poor pacing as the trains traverse those turns extremely slowly. So slow in fact that if nature were to 360 no-scope this ride with 0.069 force, that would already be enough to valley the train to a standstill. On top of that, the barrels of each train were hindered and didn't move properly. Needless to say, Windjammer was one heavy maintenance nightmare for Knott's. Just within its few weeks of operation, Windjammer already needed several major repairs costing around $2 million. Holy crap, that is one expensive pile of turd. Windjammer would ultimately remove the racing element in 1998, leaving only one side to operate at a time. Then the yellow track ceased operations entirely the following year in 1999. It was such a disaster for the coaster that Windjammer closed on March 2nd, 2000. That's right, the coaster only lasted 3 years before Knott's decided to abandon its infant. What happened after the closure is probably the most American thing to do. Shortly after closing Windjammer, Knott's sued Togo regarding the damages of Windjammer Surf Racers. Ah, America. Of course a lawsuit would eventually show up here on Ride Analyze. You get mad at them once, you cost them thousands of dollars. Knott's claimed that Togo sold them a product littered with defects, alleging the faulty design caused the ride to essentially self-destruct, similar to when you enter a school bathroom in the Middle East. Whatever Togo agreed to in that contract, they breached that contract, leaving Knott's with that $2 million repair bill I mentioned earlier. The coaster was left standing but not operating for a year to prove as evidence. The park's lawyer Boyd Jensen called this ride an embarrassment, saying that, quote, the manufacturer made promises that the ride simply hasn't lived up to. Overall, Knott's would end up suing Togo seeking $17 million in damages. On the other hand, Togo argued that Knott's cut corners to the ride and that this lawsuit was a money grab to afford a bigger, better ride. Togo's attorney Jim Yukovich said, quote, it was really a business decision where they turned around and made a money grab to cover the cost of new equipment. Meanwhile, Windjammer would be scrapped from the property in July 2001. At this point, management was eager to get such a disastrous ride off their property. This legal battle would last until November 2003. This is when the jury rejected Knott's lawsuit in favor of Togo International. But by then, the damage to Togo's reputation was already done and that they never recovered. The same year Windjammer was demolished, Togo filed for Chapter 7 bankruptcy and closed its American offices. Surprisingly, the company is still in business today making parts for their existing coasters, but they haven't built a new coaster since that bankruptcy in 2001. As for the plot of land, Knott's needed a new signature attraction to fit onto that plot of land. The result ended up being Accelerator for the 2002 season. This is the prototype intimate accelerator. The ride would utilize a powerful hydraulic launch to blast the train to 80 miles per hour into a 200-foot top hat, followed by a couple of banked turns. While the ride is short, Accelerator would pack a rock-solid punch that would delight guests for the next 2 decades. Unfortunately, Accelerator would end up being one of the most problematic roller coasters of all time. That is thanks to the complex hydraulic launch Accelerator uses. That launch system would go on to be one of, if not the most problematic coaster systems of all time. Thank you all so much for watching this video. This video is part of my series where we dive into roller coasters and other amusement rides history and dynamics. Since you watched to the end, be a homie and do these tasks shown on screen. That way it alerts the YouTube algorithm to push this content to more viewers. And if you want to stay alerted for new uploads, at least consider pressing the subscribe button with notifications turned on. Finally, I have more videos you might be interested in linked here. This is the Coaster Flood, riding out.